Well, thank you so much, Tessie, and a very good afternoon from Nairobi in Kenya. So as Tessie already said, my name is Kim. I'm a conflict-sensitive programming specialist focused on anticipatory action with FAO. So my role is actually quite global. So that means that I work with country and regional teams in the most conflict-affected areas across the world. Let me just see if I can get this to actually work. Sorry, I'm having a slight little problem here. There we are. All right. So why is an agency like FAO interested in anticipatory action in and on conflict? Now, FAO has been a founding member of the Anticipatory Action Task Force, been involved in it for many years, working very closely with other agencies such as IFRC, the World Food Programme, a host of other international organizations and national organizations working on this. So one of the things that FAO does in collaboration with WFP as part of the Global Coalition Against Food Crises is to compile these so-called hunger hotspot reports that be coming out 3 times a year. We probably only going to release them twice a year. They are very, very time-consuming to produce. So this is actually a snapshot from our latest iteration, which covered the period from October last year up to this month. And as you can see from the map, the countries that we included in the hunger hotspot report are overwhelmingly countries that are also affected by conflict, both armed conflict, other conflict issues. And conflict for many of these countries is a main driver, one of the main drivers of acute food insecurity. So all of these countries are facing acute food insecurity, at least at crisis or IPC level 3, most of them above. And several of these countries, I think such a country like Congo DRC has been featured in every edition of this report. The purpose of this report is actually because it's prepared a couple of months in advance. This report was prepared in August last year, covering October to January, simply highlighting the countries where food security data, food prices, conflict data, a host of different information, including also, of course, climate forecasts indicated that these countries were at increased risks. I should also mention that none of these countries would have been included just because they were in protracted crises. They're all included because new or emerging risks to food security were emerged for the reporting period. So for FAO, conflict sensitivity is an absolute non-negotiable, no matter what context we work in, for a host of different reasons. Now, there's probably a lot of conflict practitioners in our webinar. Sometimes when we do these presentations, we have a lot of people coming from various backgrounds, but just wanted to do a little bit of a reminder, a refresher on why conflict sensitivity is so critical. And obviously, we're talking about the very many different effects or impacts on community relations and on perceptions that our actions can entail. So for FAO, we're very much working around concepts around whether we are in or on conflict. Working around conflict, basically being conflict blind, simply isn't an option. And that means any anticipatory action in context affected by fragility, crisis, or various types of conflict and violence, excuse me, we need to, as a very, very minimum, make sure that our interventions are conflict sensitivity. And this has been a gap, I dare say, for the anticipatory action sector so far. So what is conflict sensitivity? And because we're a little pressed for time, instead of asking you all to weigh in here, just quickly running through that conflict sensitivity, as a lot of you probably know, is that the ability for us as humanitarian or development actors to understand the context we're operating in, understand how that context always interact with whatever intervention we're implementing, and then act upon this understanding in order to, as a very, very minimum, minimize the negative impacts. And this is where a lot of UN agencies are tasked by the UN Secretary General to also make sure that we contribute wherever possible to sustaining peace. So we're basically talking about a full cycle endeavor. So for FAO, we have a very definite approach, like a very, very firm approaches to how we actually do this. As the very, very first start, the context analysis, absolutely fundamental. And this is actually challenging potentially a little bit this one of the slides that Catalina showed, because for us, the context analysis needs to guide every single step before we even get into considering to design and involve stakeholders in designing anticipatory action. And this is so that we can basically integrate as a minimum conflict sensitivity throughout the program or project cycle. So below here, I've outlined the steps in setting up anticipatory action, either a one-off project or as part of a larger AA protocol that often involves a whole host of stakeholders. So basically, we're looking at disaster risk prioritization, identifying existing early warning information and any existing systems and checking that they're up to task, and developing the triggers that will actually set basically trigger anticipatory action. The identification of pre-agreed anticipatory action. There was a question on the chat about the timing of this, which is something I'll touch upon very briefly. And the targeting, as those of you who work on conflict sensitivity know, targeting and the actual activities often entails a lot of conflict sensitivity issues, but also through the implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and the very key learning. Something all the anticipatory action stakeholders currently working is very, very dedicated to, because the learning is what basically allows us to do anticipatory action better in the future. Excuse me. So the key to conflict sensitivity for us, as I already said, we have a couple of tools, methodologies that we apply to setting up projects and programs. These allow us to work very participatory with the main stakeholders to determine the context, inquire about the conflict dynamics, look at the various stakeholders, including actors to and in and affected by any conflict unfolding or anticipated to unfold. Then look at the potential peace and conflict impacts of the anticipatory action program that we are endeavoring to put in place. And based on all of this, we are looking at programming options and potentially going back to tweak the identified anticipatory actions that were already pre-identified. If you go to our website, and I'm happy to share links, but I think they're scattered all over, there's a whole lot of context analyses available. This one is one that was done in the Goma region last year, looking at environmental issues and drivers of conflict. So went a little too fast. So the timing, one of our key tools, and I really wanted to present a couple of ways that we work. It's very comprehensive. It's very difficult to capture everything in a short presentation. But one of our key tools is to develop a crisis timeline. Now, the crisis timeline basically captures everything that is uncovered as we're doing our consultations, engaging with the various stakeholders to kind of like define the seasonalities. So the agricultural calendar for FAO, that means also the cropping calendar, any livestock seasonal migration, any other livelihoods activities that are central here. And this is basically then overlaid with climate information. So when is rainy season, when is dry season. Then on the timeline, as you can see, we also outline, and of course this can change as we're seeing with failed rains currently in East Africa. We're in the middle of the 5th consecutive failed rainy season with the 6th anticipated. So this is obviously a little bit based on previous climate trends and looking at data over a period of years going back. But then the anticipated impact on drought, again, also using historical data together with forecasted data. So what are the impacts of this? Is obviously very much for FAO, on crops, on livestock, on fisheries, and agricultural labor. And all of this is then pinned down. What we then add on here is what are the early warning triggers that can trigger. It's difficult to capture everything on one screen, but I'll share the presentation. to kind of really pin down what are the windows where we can feasibly and in a timely manner implement anticipatory action. As you'll see in the second line here, this is basically demonstrating that we have a very phased approach because different impacts have been identified in the first slide on, for instance, crops and different impacts on livestock, which means that we have different timeframes to basically implement these activities in. And then in green, we have the identified anticipatory actions outline. Now, this example doesn't include any actions intended to mitigate or prevent any conflict from arising or escalating or being compounded. So one of the tools we also have in the toolbox is basically overlaying the crisis timeline with seasonal calendars. So obviously very much looking at the cyclical events that happen throughout every year. As most of you probably know, the agricultural calendar in agricultural communities very much ties in with social, cultural, economic, and political events that kind of happens regularly throughout the year. One example from South Sudan, for instance, is a dry season that also coincides with pastoral migration. Also in some communities coincide with the wedding season, which, and for some communities in South Sudan, to get married, you need to pay dowry. To pay dowry, you need cattle. How do you get your cattle? Well, there are other communities potentially migrating with their cattle closer to where you reside. So these seasons often can be pinned fairly. We can pin down those trends to basically illustrate how some seasons have higher risks of conflicts arising or being compounded. So just to give you a quick example, because I don't have time to go into too many, but we're happy to take bilateral conversations. We set up a project in Congo DRC for conflict-induced displacement, basically looking at available data. On the right-hand side, you can see that we had some conflict early warning indicators that we were monitoring against, including number of displaced people, and having a methodology for setting the severity level, and then weighing that against available IPCs of food insecurity classification data, and also the feasibility of, for instance, being able to access in a timely manner. I should note here that as of now, this has not been triggered, so I cannot share any lessons learned. And one of the shortcomings that we've also identified in some of our anticipatory action programs is that because of these very definite time windows for action, thinking back in terms of what do you need to have in place, not just the funding, but also in terms of human capacities, technical input, various other things, logistics and procurement, quite big factors to take into account here. And then in a context where you have access constraints, all of this comes together to basically potentially indicate that anticipatory action is simply not feasible and should be a no-go option for acting. I just want to share a couple of resources. These were put in your folder as well. These are open for everyone who's interested. So this is basically how we guide the development and implementation of any of our programs as much as we can, because this is not always done. Unfortunately, we have a program clinic approach that basically is a step-by-step approach to design conflict-sensitive interventions, anticipatory action or not. There's both a facilitation guide and a participants workbook. There's a guide to context analysis. The context analysis, as you know, the absolute basic requirement to ensure conflict-sensitive programming. And then a very recent publication that demonstrate how we can think through our theories of change to really critically investigate whether our projects, as a minimum, are conflict-sensitive and ideally contribute to peace. So that was everything from my side. Sorry if I ran over time.